In 2022, I hope that people learned from the 3 years that we were in COVID. People need people to survive.
The pandemic has really impacted the prison system and has really brought to light a lot of the things that were already so wrong with how health is accessed within the system.
It is time to show the faces and hear the stories of older Black women artists who have struggled, who have fought, and who have survived some of the issues that we see today. It's like we've fought them before.
Our project involves 6 incredible artists, 3 of whom are Indigenous artists and 3 of whom are coming from newcomer refugee backgrounds. This work that asks them important questions around placemaking, around culture, around history, around Etobicoke, around Toronto.
So the way that we've designed the program, it's specifically about the Black Creek and about the history of the Black Creek. And it is a guided walking tour. We have several different guides, but we also wanted to make sure that there were activities involved. So we wanted people to be engaged, not just passive.
The project is about the women of immigration of the Italian diaspora who essentially immigrated to Canada post-World War II. We have coined a phrase where we say, we must listen to the silence of the women, because they never had a real platform to speak.
Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome. We've got a wonderful live audience here at the Arts Etobicoke Storefront Gallery, and people tuning in from their homes to our our Stories of Significance gallery exhibition. That's part of the Myseum Intersections 2022. And I have the incredible pleasure of speaking with Susan Blight and Philip Cote today. I'm going to try and not speak very much because Susan and Philip are people that I love to listen to and very much respect. So it's really a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you for coming in and being here in person. It's really special to be present and talking to people without screens.
Rich.
So welcome everybody, and thank you to Myseum Intersections for making this all possible. Before we get into the discussion, we would like to acknowledge the land that we're working on. And I'm going to invite my exceptional colleague, Shama, to come up and deliver her land acknowledgement.
Hello, my name is Shama Patel. I am the operations manager here at Arts Etobicoke, and I come as a first-generation American with parents via Africa and India, and I have been here in Toronto, and I'm very happy and proud to call Toronto my home. And today we are gathering here from across Toronto, and we are grateful to be working on this land. We acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse nations, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This treaty and other agreements, including the One Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and all of its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were and continue to be invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. And we're very mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land as well as with each other. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers and immigrants in this generation or generations past, and I'd like to acknowledge those who have come here forcibly, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. I honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. I'd personally like to acknowledge my own state of learning and understanding of the internal biases that I carry. And at Arts Etobicoke, we're in constant state of learning, and we're committed to growing and working within an anti-oppression and anti-bias framework. We're living in an important time of change, and we want to continue to treat this acknowledgement as a living statement that we can grow with as we learn and grow. Thank you.
Thanks, Shama. I suspect we'll be talking a lot about the land today. The project that we're working on is about place. And both Susan and Philip, you're Indigenous artists, for those who don't know. So I'm going to explain the project in a bit, but what I'd really like to do is have you introduce yourselves. And people are here to hear you talk. So I'm sorry I'm not going to introduce you, but I'm going to have you do it because I think you'll probably do a much better job at it than I will. So please, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and then please tell us a little bit about your art practice. And Susan, you're actually right beside me, so I'm going to ask you to go first.
I think Philip should go first.
Okay.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my name is Nochmo Mashkogiash. That's my traditional name, and that's a story in itself, you know, because everybody knows me as Cote the Third, and it's true, you know, based on my history here and my connection through this system, this colonial system. But my name Mashkogiash is the real family name. And my great-grandfather gave it up when he disenfranchised, you know, about 60 years ago. He decided to leave the reserve because he needed to find work to support his family. And when he did, they said that he would have to give up his Indigenous status. So he did what he had to do. And so he thought, well, since I'm doing all this, he asked if he could change his name to fit into the community better where he was going to go. And he changed his name to Philip Cote. So that's where the name Cote comes in to our family. And so for years and years and years, until about the last maybe 6 years ago, we discovered that this was our grandfather. This was our real name. So we didn't know, and it was really hard to find it in the archives where these changes all happened. So there's a lot of Indigenous people out there with settler names. They don't know where the name comes from. But I was really lucky to discover this. But what's more important about this name, Mashkogiash, it's not the fact that it was changed, it's the fact that what that name means. So I knew this name for a few years, and I've been spreading it around slowly that this is my real name. And an elder came up to me a few years ago at a powwow, and he asked me, he said, do you know what that name means? And I said, no, I just know that it means Red Seagull. And he said, yeah, that's correct, but do you know what that means itself? And I said, no. So I was pretty shocked that there was another meaning behind my name that I didn't know about. So the elder began to tell me the story about all the animals before the Indigenous people, before any people got to this land. They were here and they were talking amongst themselves about the different gifts each of them had. And so everybody was showing off what they had, their gift, and except the Red Seagull. The Red Seagull said, no, this is private, you know, I want to keep it to myself. And so, of course, all the animals were very curious and wanted to know what the seagull's gift was. And so they decided to find a way to get him to drop his bundle so they could see what was in the bundle. And so finally they scared the seagull so badly, he dropped his bundle, and out came the sun, and the sun's been going around the planet ever since. So it's a very powerful name, and it has a lot to do with what I do today, which is bringing our culture into the open so that we can talk about these differences. And Indigenous people indeed do see the world. Our cosmology is so different, and our worldview is different because of that. And we see things differently, and we have a deeper understanding in our connection to the earth and the animals. And a lot of our wisdom comes from the land. And academia calls that land-based pedagogy. So what that means is that our every bit of wisdom that our ancestors were observing on the land was recorded and became part of our culture. So when we talk about Indigenous culture, even my name, we're talking about all of those things and how we connect to the earth. So that's a bit of a long way of talking about Mushkogeyaash, but see, when you have to really take apart these cultural kind of invisibilities, you begin to open up this huge dynamic that transcends across the land, and I think that's what's important about today, why we're here and what we're going to talk about is these objects that are part of this presentation, these art kind of expressions that tell the stories of the land and tell the stories about who the artist is too, because these are not just random. Well, mine isn't. I can't speak for Susan, but mine isn't random. It's really, I really thought about this, and I thought about the history in connection to the animation, which I think is awesome.
Can you talk a little bit about your art practice for
Yeah.
those who are not familiar?
Well, okay, so the land-based pedagogy is like a really good place to start with my art practice. There's a lot of my art is connected with history, it's connected to storytelling, it's connected to oral histories, and it's connected to that Indigenous history that is not part of the narrative of the land here. We're in a place where there's a settler narrative that describes everything, but when the settler narrative begins to describe Indigenous people, it becomes a false narrative for Indigenous people. We are recognized by their ideology, and so their narratives are very exclusive, and they more or less I guess they enhance their story on this land. It's not something that's a benefit to Indigenous people to hear the narratives being described. So my art practice is based on taking those narratives apart and opening it up for Indigenous voice to be heard again on the land, because our Indigenous voices were silenced for 500 years, and now they're just beginning to rise up. And it's not an accident, you guys. This is happening because we are in the eighth fire. And the eighth fire is a prophecy that was told was going to happen after we gone through this gauntlet of genocide. And that's a good word to use, because that's something that a lot of these recognized institutions across the country and in Toronto, they're not willing to accept yet. And because when you hear the word genocide, a lot of people, they take a couple of steps back and they don't even know if they want to talk about the subject. But it's important, because if you're going to be a practicing artist, we need to talk about the truth of our history here. And that's what my art does. It's a truth bearer, and not necessarily hitting settlers over the head, but I'm bringing out the truth about Indigenous people. And that narrative still has yet to be accepted as a standard practice in this country and in the institutions of learning.
Great. Thank you. So happy that you're here to talk with us, and can't wait to hear more over the next couple hours. Susan, please.
Thanks. Thank you. Ani Boju, Mekanaknan Dodam, Nananiguni Bignindigo, Kuchishing and Donji, Minoa Toronto Digitanongom. So my English name is Susan Blight. My clan is Snapping Turtle. I am a citizen of the Nishnawbe Nation Treaty Number 3. I'm a member at Kuchiching First Nation. That's where my mom is also a member at, and my maternal grandfather. My maternal grandmother comes from the Cachuanan, also in Treaty 3. And my father's mother comes from Riskosimini Zibing, which in English is Big Grassy First Nation, also in Treaty 3. I've lived in Toronto for about 10 years now. I'm really, at this point, feel like I have two homes. I have my homelands in Treaty 3, and I've tried to make a home here in Toronto. And what that means is coming to understand what it means to be a guest here, to be in good relation, to contribute to this place, to the reclamation of this land as Indigenous land. So that's been an ongoing journey. Like Philip, I'm an artist, a visual artist with an interdisciplinary practice. So I have both a solo and a collaborative practice. I'm part of a couple of different collectives. The first being a collective called Ogima Mikana with Hayden King, and the second is a collective called Indigenous Roots with Ben Donahue, Amanda Strong, and Archer Pachowis. And that collective really works to do workshops that give free new media training for Indigenous youth, young people. Aside from my art practice, I also am an assistant professor at OCAD University and the chair of Indigenous Visual Culture there at OCAD. And I'm also a PhD candidate in social justice education at Boise. I'm studying with Dr. Etobicoke. So my practice is really all of my work, all of my interdisciplinary practices come together with a common goal of, much like Philip, uncovering histories that have been erased, reclaiming everything that has been severed by colonialism. I use my art practice to reclaim and relearn things that are rightfully mine and ours as Anishinaabe people, while at the same time, hopefully contributing to a broader sort of dialogue or project of decolonization and justice. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you very much. Just in awe. It's really special that we get a chance to talk to both of you today. I will talk a little bit about the project and what we at Arts Etobicoke asked the two of you to do. And that was to pick a site in Etobicoke that you were interested in exploring, and then use augmented reality to place that work in that site. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with augmented reality, you'd download an app and then you'd hold up your phone or your device and you'd see digitally that work in that site or in that environment. We had asked 3 Indigenous artists as well as 3 newcomer artists to explore significant sites in Etobicoke that may not be known to people or may only be known within certain communities. And then, so in the gallery here, and especially for those who are tuning in from home and can't see it, we realized that a huge amount of research went into these sites, as well as the stories. So we wanted to bring all that research and stories into one place so that people could truly understand the levels and the depth of the research that went into it. So that's where we're in the space. Many people have not actually seen your projects. So maybe the first place to start is actually if you could just talk about your site, why you chose the site, and then the artwork that you, or your work that you then digitally placed there. Philip.
Okay. Well, Colonel Samuel Smith Park is a really great location. It's a piece of land that was developed to hold a small harbor for the boats and things. But it was connected to original territory, which was, where the history of Indigenous people is really kind of faint. Not a lot of people have any wonders or any connection to this part of the land around here. And, it's Etobicoke South, but it's an important piece of property because that was the pivotal point of the agreement that finally sealed the deal on the purchase, because it was this strip of land that they were talking about that wasn't negotiated properly. So I don't know if you guys know that, but that's what's happening. So there's a much older history that goes back to the Ice Age, and it goes back to the Ice Age through the flora on the land. So the flora is really important, and you can tell why we call this place Etobicoke. A place of the alders. We're talking about alder trees. So if you look around the neighborhood, you might have a hard time finding them because you don't even know what they look like, right? So you have to educate yourself and you have to know what these trees look like, and you'll see them. And they're pretty specific. They have a gray kind of bark, smooth, with little traces of overlapping that kind of reminds you of birch bark. But not quite that smooth or white, and they're this really kind of contemporary gray. They're making the cars that color these days, but they're there, and they're all varying ages. And what's important to note about these alder trees is that these are colonizing trees. which was really important at the end of the last ice age because the land was stripped because of the temperatures that happened here, that the only thing that could grow was something that could grow on top of the ice for a short time, which was tundra and things like that, tundra grass, small shrubs. So there was no trees here and when that ice age began to recede about 15,000 years ago, these were the first trees that arrived. They came to reclaim the land first. So they took root and they began to spread across the land. And what was important about their success is that their seeds and their germinating strands were all connected to the same tree. So the tree didn't need other trees to pollinate. The pollination can happen within one tree because the trees have these little cones. They look like little pine cones. They're really tiny, maybe about that big. And then they have these long strands that hang down. And this is where the pollen is. The seeds are in the cones. And then when the wind blows, it blows it right onto the cones on the same tree. So that's why they call it a colonizing tree, is because it can grow its own offspring and just transplant that offspring wherever the wind blows. That's where these trees will begin to grow. So I did my background research on this Etobicoke and about these alder trees, and I already knew some things about this place here, and a lot of people met these original people, these first settlers that came onto this territory. It wasn't even known as Ontario yet, but before it was Ontario, and they met the people, and they thought these people were called the Etobicoke. So, and who were these people that they're talking about? So there's not a lot of information in the archives about this, but these people were the Algonquins, and the Potawatomis were here. And so this is where my family comes into the story, because I have Algonquin ancestry and I have a Potawatomi ancestry. And, when I go back 8 generations, I have about 8 different nations of people that I'm connected through marriage. And you might ask yourself how that happened. How did all these different nations get mixed up in this one family? Well, you have to think about when colonization happened, a lot of people were removed from their original territories and they were bunched into one place. And that's how it happened. So, it's part of our story. That should be a part of a common story of a lot of Indigenous people about how these families become all these intermingling of nations and how that all happened. It's just like the alder tree, spreading the seeds in one little place. And so I think the other important thing was my grandfather talking about this place in particular, and in terms of our memory of the ancient people that used to live here, because we have stories about those ancient people, and those people were, in today's standards, we call them giants because they were tall. They were 10 feet tall. And there's a lot of stories. When you look through the archives, you'll see lots of stories about giant Indigenous people. Well, they say giant Indians. And so my grandfather had a story about this one particular giant, and his name was Joida. And Joida was, very mysterious individual. And the story is very mysterious too, because it talks about these individuals having great power. And the great power was their size, but also, if you know something about our creation story, you know that in our creation stories we talk about giants, and we talk about the original man's father being a giant. He was 10 feet tall, and his name was known as the being with terrible power, because he was in control of the thunder and lightning, and that's what his power was. And so when you talk about the original man's arrival and how he, after having a family and everything, he still hasn't found out why he's here yet. So he ends up going on this long journey across the land to go and meet his father. And he was told that his father were in the mountains in the west. So up the Rocky Mountains, he travels across the land to the Rocky Mountains. And he goes up to meet his father, and it's an encounter. There's a battle that ensues, and they fight one another until the original man lashes out at his father, and he cuts him on the pant leg, and it cuts through, and he sees that he's bleeding, that he's injured his father, and the fight stops. father says, I give up, I owe you a reason why you're here. And so that fight was intended to be the battle between fathers and sons for all time. It would never happen again. So that meant respect between fathers and sons. And so when he finally, defeated him, he realized that he's something more than we can see. And we have lots of stories about these beings that were kind of half spirit and half physical. And so that's who his father was. He saw that his father had this kind of aura about him. He wasn't just physical, even though he had this battle with him, but he sees that he's different than he is. But the thing about the original man is that he had that same thing. So whatever was flowing through the bloodstream of that original man, it's still flowing through our bloodstream. It's still here. And so how long does it take to wake that up? We're in the process of doing that. We're re-emerging in our Indigenous vision and narratives. And, my story is about that, taking hold of these old stories and trying to bring them into the contemporary world and, blending, because that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to blend this present world that we're in, and we're going to have to open that up to this, being able to talk about these stories without any shame. And we have to talk about them in a way where we can begin to bring it into reality, where it's not just a mythology or a fable, because I think the stories were very real. And I've had experiences myself, because I'm a sun dancer, and I've been involved in sweat ceremonies for 35 years now. But I've seen a lot of things that I can't explain. So I know that when our ancestors were talking about these kinds of stories, they were inviting us to not to judge, and just to sit and listen and open up and begin to wonder ourselves, because each one of us is on a journey, and that journey is to learn our purpose here. We all have a purpose, and that purpose is unfolding in all of us. And it's not easy, because we all have these complications and obstacles that are part of our being born into our families, because our families are not flawless. Everyone here in the room knows what I'm talking about. And it's good, because we should all be collectively together. We should all understand one another, and there should be no reason to hesitate about talking about your truth in a room. And even if it's a cultural difference, there's a lot of cultures where a lot of what I'm talking about, they talk about it too. And so until you bring it to the floor, everyone doesn't know. So someone has to be the first one to start talking about these as a reality, and also as a measuring stick. Like, how far can we go this way, and how much can we talk about those kinds of things? Because believe me, I would want to talk about even more deeper things connected with this story, because this Joida, there's stories, a lot of stories about these giants across the land. And I'm really happy that my grandfather was able to tell me that story, because we never had a good relationship. My grandfather was this stoic individual to me. I don't know if it was to everyone, but I definitely had a difficult relationship with my grandfather. But that one story I heard, and I hung on to the story. And so I'm really happy to share it in this animation, because I think it's like the doorway is now to begin to start talking more about these connections to the land here. And our history is so faint, but this is one of those stepping stones where we're going to make room to begin to start sharing that Indigenous narrative, which I think is needed in this world, because this world is too top heavy, so too much up here, not enough here. So Indigenous kind of narratives are really always based on that hard thinking, and the hard thinking is the long-term thinking. Long-term thinking is, just don't think about yourself for now. in your success, your personal success of having a job, buying a house, getting a car, having a little piece of property, some kind of stature in a company. That's not long-term thinking. Long-term thinking is this stuff that we're doing here right now, because these stories are the stories that our descendants need to hear. They need to know the rich history of Indigenous people, and that's what this artwork is about passing on this ancestry that is not just meant for me, it's meant to go on, because all the Potawatomis and all the Algonquins, they all need to know that this is part of their history.
Wonderful. And for those who go and see the project, what's outstanding about you, Philip, is you're incredibly talented at telling the story, but you can also do it visually. So you've created a beautiful animation.
Yes.
And you're incredibly artistic. So there's another way that you can shed the stories, which is what you've done in this project.
Yeah. So if you go down to Colonel Samuel Smith Park, and you go right past Lakeshore, you go south on Kipling. It's not Kipling anymore. I can't remember the name of the street, but you go straight down into the park. And that first big bend you hit, and you'll see the place where the buses turn around. The grass on the south there has all these bowing trees. Those are all alder trees. And so that's what my animation was created for, to talk about these alder trees and their connection to the land and connection to those ancient people who were spoken of as spirits and giants. And it was those people and their spiritual connection to cultural practice. Because when we're at a roadblock in our lives, Indigenous people don't just stop. What Indigenous people do is they pull out their medicine bundles and they pull out their smudge, and they begin to smudge, and they begin to start getting themselves ready and opening the spiritual door to look for solutions when there's none in sight. And so in the animation, the elder does that. He does the smudge, he does a sacred fire. He opens a spiritual door to connect with those ancestors and those spiritual forces out there that brought that giant to the village. So that's the real message in this animation. It's about the spiritual connection that came as a result of that faith in your culture and practice. And that's what brought the giant. It's not an accident that the giant came out of nowhere after he lit that sacred fire and he put the smudge and he put the tobacco in. It opened a door, and those doors are still opening even today. You can go down to, Lakeshore there, and you can light a sacred fire down there, and you'll watch the wind will change, because the land still remembers us, and the land is listening for us. So when Indigenous people go out in these places anywhere here, the land knows them, and it speaks to us, and it wants us to know that somebody's listening. You're not alone.
Thank you. Susan, the question was your site in Etobicoke and the project that you created in response to that site.
Yes, for sure. I'm excited about this because I've been looking for work about giants. So I'm like, yeah, no, that's and when Philip talks about giants, we think of it as like myth or legend or something, but it's not. They were actually real beings on the earth, and like even early European settlers wrote about them in their travelogues, but it was very much covered up by institutions like the Smithsonian and things like that. But we'll talk about that later. Yes, that's amazing. So my site, yes, I chose. So as I mentioned before, a lot of my work is about sort of coming to understand things that have been withheld from me, or that where the impacts of colonization have stood in the way of me knowing something that is, that belongs to myself via my nation. And so I've utilized my work to try to reconnect those things and to really learn about who I am as an Anishinaabe person in the world in 2022. And so I've also tried to utilize my work, as I mentioned before. It's really important to me, because of Anishinaabe protocol, it's important to me to be a good guest while I'm here. And so I've tried to use my work to come to understand things about this place, specifically and especially the Toronto waterways. So I've done a project about the Don River. I've tried to take that time to research and not only to create artwork, but to understand place and understand water. And so I didn't really know much about the Humber River. So I chose the Humber River, but I specifically chose the site where it's one site along that trail where the bridge crosses over the river. And in reading about the Humber River, I came across an article by John Johnson, who probably a lot of people in the room know, historian, and John is actually the partner of one of my best friends, Karen Recollet, somebody I work with a lot and collaborate with. And in reading that article, one of the things that struck me was John mentioned these lush cornfields that existed at one time within the Humber River Valley and in fact, all along the Humber River. And so as an artist and a researcher, I'm always looking for things that, as people invested in decolonization, things that we can sort of reorient ourselves towards, like our sort of true governing bodies. Philip mentioned that Indigenous people are land-based people and spiritually based people. And that's true. And those things aren't separate. Our connection to the land is a spiritual connection as well. And so it occurred to me to think about the Humber River as a governing body is something that we should reorient ourselves towards to really understand reciprocity and all of the things that you mentioned, or that was mentioned in the land acknowledgement, the things that are mentioned in the Dish with One Spoon, how we put that into practice. And so those cornfields, the vision of these lush cornfields was something I held as a symbol of a futurity that we might want to think about reclaiming and reconnecting with. Like, what would it mean to govern ourselves towards the Humber River, and specifically towards the return of these cornfields? What would it mean to work towards that as a goal? So then I started to think about corn from an Anishinaabe perspective. And I remembered that there was a story about corn, which I won't necessarily relate here, but it has to do, it's a creation story, essentially, an Anishinaabe creation story about how we came to be in relation to corn. And it involves a man who was struggling because it was a bad hunting or fishing season. And so he prayed and he fasted for help from Creator, and essentially, without telling the whole story, essentially a spirit came down from the sky, and this spirit is described as a handsome spirit dressed in bright yellow and green. And the man was meant to struggle with this spirit and overcome him over the course of 3 different days. And he eventually does. And he's told to bury this spirit in the ground and care for that gravesite, water, good soil, all of those things. All that to say, this is where corn comes from. Eventually that spirit grows into the corn plant. And that story, actually, this idea of the spirit, the sky spirit coming down and becoming corn, is actually coded in the word, Anishinaabe word for corn, which is mandamin. And this is something that I found in Basil Johnston's Ojibwe Heritage, which is the breakdown, the etymological breakdown of that word. And manda means extraordinary, but even more so, it means not of this land, not of this place, from somewhere else. And then mean is very. So even coded within the word is this idea that corn is from the sky world. It's from somewhere else, which I found to be something that I was interested in as a kind of gesture towards an Indigenous futurity. So that's all in that project. Essentially, what people are meant to do is to stop on the bridge that crosses over the Humber River, take out their phones, and what you see is a graphic I made about corn. And in Anishinaabe Mawin, it translates to English as corn comes from the sky world. And my hope is that it intrigues people and they start to think about locality and futurity and histories that are covered up, histories that are invalidated, categorized as myth or legend. These aren't myth or legends to us. These are actual historical events. And one thing that I always think about is what Vine Deloria writes about, which is that our creation stories are much more about geography than we give them credit for. That, in fact, Indigenous creation stories are just as important to creation stories are where they happened as what happened. The where is part of the creation story. So we can think of it as a kind of geography.
We need like 5 hours to talk about all this stuff. All these little tangents are off of each one of these stories.
I was just thinking I'm going to throw out my questions. Like,
No, I'm done. But
that has to be done. That's the point.
That was the inspiration for the project, and it was a real joy to research and to make these different connections and to learn a little bit more about our relationship to corn. Yeah.
Well, this is really connected to string theory and wormholes, what she's talking about, the sky world.
Yeah.
Because we have stories about these people that run shaking tent ceremonies, and they're really particular kind of vessels. It looks like a big seed pod that and then the elder goes in, and then that energy comes through this lodge, and it starts to shake terribly. That people will wonder if he's okay in there because it's going crazy and the whole thing's shaking. They don't know how he can do it. They say he's been doing it for an hour now, shaking. Because when settlers came to witness these ceremonies, they thought he was in there shaking it, right? But he wasn't. The spirits were doing it. So the story that I got on these shaking tents is that these are actually places where a wormhole happens. And the wormhole, he goes to this place called the Hole in the Sky. And a hole in the sky is a star system. It's up in the sky. You can see it. And that star system, our ancestors can see us from there, and they can see everything. And I need a diagram here because I usually do have diagrams when I'm talking about these kind of things. But we have there's a really great creation story map of birch bark squirrel design that I use because I talk about our culture and our cosmology. But on this description of our whole history is the pictographic imagery on a pathway that kind of bends around on itself. All these lines coming off up and bottom and top of this line represent the physical world, and then below represents the spirit world. So the physical world, you're limited to what we can see. But in the spirit world, you can see the whole story, and you can go to every part in the story. You can even go backwards into the story when you're on the other side. And so how do we get there? We go into our ceremonies. All of our ceremonies are designed to get us to the edge of that world. That's why we do ceremonies, because we're looking for assistance from the spirit world. That story about that spirit coming down to bring the corn onto the earth. We're talking about the hole in the sky and how one of those spirits came down, and they're not tiny. These are 10-foot tall spirits. They're there and they come. And so when you talk about those things, we don't all have the knowledge to lay out the whole background of each one of these stories, but that's part of it, because you said the story, but I can tell you the background behind all these connections. And this is how we are supposed to operate in our communities. And that stopped when colonialism happened. We stopped sharing these stories in circles where we can expand our knowledge and expand how we can describe things, So you'll be able to kind of talk more about your corn spirit now, because you know that these are all these connections. But these things are really important because this is where we're limited, and so many of our elders, even our elders, don't know this stuff. They know bits and pieces, just like what we're doing today here. We're sharing bits and pieces of our knowledge, but we're at this point where they call it reexistence. We're in the reexistence modes, and we're going to expand on this territory, because we're we're in a place of decolonizing in order to begin to have that voice again and stop doubting ourselves, because a lot of our stories are very fantastic, and so when we start thinking about those, because we were raised in a Western society, we automatically put our stories into mythology. But I stopped doing that just because I've seen so many things in ceremonies at Sundance, and I've seen people do things that you can't unsee, and becomes even mythology. My stories are almost mythological because the things that I've seen at Sundance is like, I saw an elder split a storm in two, and the storm split in half and went around our Sundance. And somebody who just told me that story, I would just think, but when you see it yourself, you realize that there's a force that this elder had to split a storm in two. And that force is something we can't see on him, but he did it.
Yeah. I realize my questions are very practical, so by all means, we can take it in any direction, or if there's questions from the group here. I had a question just about digital, telling stories through digital means. If you're interested in talking about or is that something that you've done in your art practice, you're doing more, does it work, or is it something that is worth exploring? We talked a little bit about kind of the digital, exploring digital tools.
Yeah, I think, my experience of the digital is that, a lot of my artwork has been vectorized in the past, and so that vectoring allows the imagery to be put into an animation. And that's what we did with this project here, is I redid all my drawings. So basically you still have to have a skill of being able to draw. So my drawings were put through a vectoring scan. After the lines were vectorized, then I could manipulate them, add color into all the little spaces. And that's what allowed each one of these characters to be used in this animation process. And so there had to be kind of like a storyboard about first the oral story, then that's made into a storyboard where you can see all the different points and pick all the different scenes for each of the backgrounds, because I haven't seen the video, so I'm really anxious to see
The final version.
And because we have an oral portion of this video now, it was just text at first, and then we through the process of sending this file back and forth across the email, and we realized that the written was taking too long. Like, you had to pause the video in order to read, because there was so much to read on each of the sections. So I realized maybe it's better if we just have somebody speak, and they can slow it down a bit, and so while they're speaking, they can say what they were describing. And so being able to describe the animation seemed to be another technical part of the whole broad kind of way of telling the story on the digital kind of file. And I guess they allowed for this the back and forth part of the text and the oral. It became the kind of the way that we filtered the design of the whole animation into being an oral where people can hear that story rather than have to read it. Because reading, it's a nice thing to do, but it's only good for a book, where you can open up the page and look at the page for a while. And it didn't work with the animation at all.
Right. And how about the augmented reality? We did a project in the village of Islington. I think you were excited about the possibility.
Yes, yeah. Oh, because I did do another project here, and I did one over it was the warplanes that were in World War II. And it allowed me to tell another story about the same grandfather, because he talked about, he was a boat builder, and he became a builder of the Mosquito warplane that they used in World War II. And it was a really interesting story, because I heard the story from him, But then I realized I had to do research in order to really kind of give out all those details about this plane in particular and all its little kind of specialties and how successful this plane was in the war, because it was so powerful. It was so fast for a propeller-driven plane, and also it was super lightweight because it was made of wood. And you know, I didn't think a lot about that when I first heard my grandfather talking about being a boat builder. I mean, I appreciate it because I saw the boats. They were really magnificent boats, because people back in those days that were having boats, they had a lot of money and they could afford these boats that were as long as this gallery here, you know, not quite as wide, but they were large boats, and he was building them. And then when he told me that he was building planes in World War II, I didn't realize that they were making planes out of wood still.
Right.
Because you think, you know, we're talking about the time of the jets and so aluminum skin and things like that, right? But they were still using wooden planes. And they picked him because they knew what a great boat builder he was, and he was going to help them build their planes. And so it's kind of nice to know that he made his contributions to kind of helping the country to take its place in you know, protecting the sovereignty of you know, having freedom of choice. And I guess, but Indigenous people in World War II coming back to the country didn't get any benefits as the other soldiers did. So there's a drawback there, but I'm glad the story still remains. It's kind of one of those stories about victory, personal one too, because you know, he was he didn't get any special recognition for that role that he played in World War II, and he wasn't a military person. He was the guy building the machines for the military.
Great story. Thank you. Susan, I've seen your you've got words and language on plaques and on street signs, but you're now in this project. It's through digital AR. So is there any thoughts on where digital arts plays a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'll preface this by saying I understand the drawbacks and negatives of the internet, and particularly, you know, the dangers of algorithms and the ways in which algorithms can work against things that we might be invested in, you know, like social justice and things like that. That I understand, but I will say that I think it is absolutely true that Native people took the internet very quickly, like very early on. You know, you had people like Archer Pachawas and other visual artists like who really took to the internet very early on. So I think that there's something about that, about the internet spatially, that is interesting for us to take up. You know, the idea of limitlessness or limitless space, or something beyond, I think, a flattened out sense of place is interesting to us spatially. So, and that's why we've sort of gravitated towards that type of digital space. That said, I think I tend to, because of my background as in academia, I tend to discuss ideas and philosophies a lot. And it's exciting to me to talk about ideas and philosophies. But I'm conscious of something that I heard Winona LaDuke say one time, and she is this brilliant organizer and, you know, thinker, and I guess she was talking to her dad one time, and her dad said to her, "Winona, I don't want to hear about your philosophies until you can grow corn." So as I was doing this project, I was thinking about that. I was like, Susan, I can't. I live in an apartment, so I can't grow corn, but I should grow something. So I'm trying to. I enjoy the digital space, but it's always balanced with the real, like what happens on the land, and how we live on the land, and how we might contribute to, because we are connected to the land. Our lives are connected to the land as Anishinaabe people. That in and of itself is issues of sustainability. Like that is relevant to where we are at now on the brink of climate catastrophe. Like that's real. So I'm always trying to balance it, you know. But I think that there's something to digital space and the internet spatially that is interesting, an interesting arena for Indigenous peoples to take up with our creative endeavors.
Wonderful.
I'm going to supply a perfect link for this, why it's so used by Indigenous artists and why it's so easy for them to connect with this whole realm. And in our creation stories, we talk about the beginning of the universe and how there was a great black void. In that black void, there was a spirit, and that spirit sent signals out into the universe 4 times, waiting for a response. When no response happened, that spirit called the signals back and said, when you come back to me, create light in the universe. And at that moment, all the stars were born. And from all those stars, planets began to form until a planet that could hold life. And this is where our story begins, because we are part of this story. So what the story is saying is that the spirit world, it called the physical world into being, because there was no physical world until that happened. And what this is talking about is that there's 2 forces, light and dark, in the universe, and everything is made of that light and dark. Everything, the floor, the ceilings, all the people here are made of this light and dark. We're all connected, just like the internet. The internet is that perfect kind of realm that reflects our beginning, the beginning of our story. Talks about how everything is connected. Okay, so for me, Indigenous people are going to rule the world from the internet.
Great.
So be careful.
Does anyone here have any questions? Yes, we do have a question. Do we need to stand near the microphone, or can we? No, we're okay. Yeah, please.
Well, thanks for all the great stories and ideas that you're sharing. But I'm still probably dumb because I don't understand how I can access the artworks that you've created for this particular project.
Very good question. Susan's is uploaded. Philip's, I think, it still needs to be put onto the app. The app is called Large. So we do have a link on our website that'll help you download that app. It's geolocated, which means that as long as you're at, I think it's about 10 kilometers away from site, you can actually open it up and see it on the app, although it's intended to be seen in that location. I believe there are steps on our website. Is that right, Anna? To get to download the app. But if you,
there's a link to the.
Yeah, very fair question. So there are 6 AR projects throughout Etobicoke. There's 3 wards in Etobicoke, 2 in each ward. So North Etobicoke, Central Etobicoke, and South Etobicoke. When one is actually right here, which is Nyle Johnston's, and we are really sad that Nyle couldn't join us today. But you can actually see his project today. So we can even help you download that app and see it.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I've got a few here, so don't feel you're on the spot.
I can share some stuff if there's no audience, because I wanted to talk about something you were talking about.
Please.
Because I just wanted to add something to what Susan was saying about the corn crops that used to be along the riverways in Toronto. So it was the Humber, Quebechinung. It was the Don River, Wisconsin-ash, and it was Chisippi, the Rouge River. These 3 rivers were really important points in terms of travel. They were part of the trade network that existed before the fur trade. So, we have a lot of confusion regarding Indigenous peoples, ingenuity, because settler history superseded Indigenous history all the time. But the reason why the fur trade was so successful was because of the Indigenous people and their trade network that was ongoing for over 5,000 years. And it was a huge network and a huge swath of territory that was connected through this trade network. And so it went from here to the Northwest Territories down to Mexico and back up through the Mississippi and Middle America. And so we had this big triangle of not only trade goods were transported through these places, but also technology, because the other important thing that was brought to Toronto was that at Hyde Park, there's a mound. People think it's a burial mound by the back of where the restaurant is, but it's an astronometry kind of observatory. And there was a medicine wheel that used to be there, and it was there for a long time. And so when those first settlers arrived in Toronto, they were admiring it, its park-like effect, and because the Indigenous people were in control of the land. The same with all the riverways. The reason why those were important points was because the travelers going these long distances had to have access to food. So corn crops were one thing, and that was because of the local Indigenous people. They were growing their corn crops there because these were floodplains, and floodplains allowed for that corn crop to grow really great big corn. And the other thing about these places was that they were under controlled burns for that amount of time, the last 5,000 years. And so what was good about controlled burns was that they allowed for the pharmacy to grow. So when I say pharmacy, what do you think of? Shoppers Drug Mart? Okay. So pharmacy is definitely all the medicines were growing on these riverways. And why is that important? Well, because travelers, they got sick sometimes and they needed access to medicines. And so that was important. The other important thing was that the reason why it was good to do the controlled burns, and that's how Wisconsin ash got its name, because that's burnt, scorched earth, right? So it got its name because, Lord Simcoe's wife asked one of the local Indigenous people, what is this place? What is this place? And so they said it's burnt, scorched earth. But he didn't say it was controlled burns, but that's what it was. It wasn't a lightning strike like they claim in the history books, because when you go look this up, it's going to say lightning strike. But the Indigenous people were doing these controlled burns for a long time. And then recently, Hyde Park, their staff has started doing controlled burns. They're going to do one really soon. So you want to go down to Hyde Park and check out what a controlled burn looks like. See what day they mark on the calendar, because one day they're going to say there's no traffic allowed in there. It's because they're doing the controlled burns. So you can go check out how they do that. And the Indigenous people were doing this for a long time, last 5,000 years. And how I know that is because they actually dug down into the earth at Hyde Park and they saw the striations going down into the earth, and they calculated a little over 5,000 years.
Awesome.
So that's amazing. And so that's what happened with all the riverways. And these connections are kind of not really registered anywhere in the history books, but these are oral histories. These are oral connections to our story. So at some point, our oral histories are gonna have to supersede the settler history, because ours is much more richer and deeper into the history than even the settlers. Because the settler history is great, but it's only short time they've been here. Our history goes back to the Ice Age and beyond that. Because when we talk about our history, we're going to go back 2 ice ages here in Ontario. And we're not talking about Anishinaabe people. We're not talking about the Wendat people or the Haudenosaunee people. We're going to talk about the Ojibwe people. These are the oldest people in North America. So the Ojibwe were before the Anishinaabe. When did the Anishinaabe come into existence? 1,200 years ago, right after the 7 fires came ashore on the Atlantic coast. This is where the Anishinaabe changed from Wabanaki to the Anishinaabe people. But the Wabanaki are the descendants of the Ojibwe. So there's a lot of really interesting history when we start talking about all the different nations and how they fan out across North America. When we're talking about the Ojibwe people, we're talking about they say that the Algonquin family language. So the Algonquin family language, there's about 36 different nations all connected. Well, they're all the same nation. They're not different nations. This is a migration trail. When you see all these different names going across the land, that's the migration trail. So we're talking about 200,000-year-old history here. And so, and even further back, when we talk about our elders talking of us being here for 2 ice ages, if you go back into archaeology and figure out how far back, it's 1 million years. So we're really going to break all of the, the benchmarks that this Eurocentric kind of narratives that we're all being, blanketed by. To tell the real story takes apart all of that. It takes apart Darwin's theory of evolution, because that means that the modern humans came out of North America when we start talking about this 1 million year mark. And I think we need to start talking about these things, because this isn't a dream. These are oral histories that have been neglected through colonization. And when our connections to the young people disappeared because of residential schools, that's where the story stopped. And that's what we're trying to get back. And so, the process, artists are the real geniuses in our communities, because the artists are the ones that are bringing up all this old stuff and putting it in public spaces. We are the new medicine people, bringing our stories into the present, for the future. I realized that that's who Morisot was. Morisot came at this crucial point in the 60s, when that was the beginning of the Indigenous revolution. Rebirth of Indigenous people happened in the 60s, because it wasn't an accident either, because when this all took place, it was because the Indigenous practice became lawful again, because it was outlawed until the 1960s. So Indigenous people could not do a pipe ceremony, they could not do a smudge, they could not do a song, because, we might start up the war parties again. And that was the real fear. So it was one of those deeply embedded fears that settlers had about Indigenous people, reclaiming their land. They could still do it even today if they wanted to. But it's about organization, right? So just putting the seed out there.
Yeah.
But we're at this crucial moment where we really have to stop and think about what we're going to say and how we're going to do it. We want it to go in the right direction, and we want to really foster, this leadership. Indigenous leadership is part of what these stories are, and because it's been very hard for Indigenous young people to find a good leader, someone they could look up to and say, yeah, I want to do something like that, or this gives me an idea, I want to start a new movement, because really, since the American Indian movement, there hasn't been a lot of real thrust in our communities. Aside from, they have these protests at all the street corners in downtown Toronto whenever they do, but that is not the same as the American Indian movement. It's a very different kind of, that's more like, it's a rally, and the American Indian movement was a real protest, and where you had to worry about your life, because they were in a time when Indigenous people were very looked at as a military kind of still, and so anybody that was protesting was deemed that kind of danger, and so those kind of things have kind of faded into the background, and we have another kind of protest, but the real kind of people that are being able to communicate properly about where we're going to go, and it's the artists, and the artists are out there telling these stories, kind of leading a trail of breadcrumbs. This is where we can go if you want to go that way. If you want to know more about this, you want to do more about this, you want to set your sights on a target for what you're going to do with your life.
Do you have any thoughts, Susan, on the role the artist plays?
No, that's it right
Well,
just that. Yeah, I think Indigenous artists have a role to play in a future that everybody should be invested in. We have always been welcoming people. We've always been people who care for other human beings and non-human beings in the land itself. So we have a lot to offer to this project of whatever Canada is going to look like. Just as Philip said, I can't say it better than that. You know, artists are the people leading the way, and oftentimes, because of virtue of our imaginations and our creativity and our ability to manifest that into something physical, we are offering a kind of vision of that.
I don't know if this will be the final question. I'm going to say the final question because it might open things up. What inspires you?
That's a big question.
It is a big question. Yeah.
Well, what inspires me? I'll tell you a story about 1967. I'm 7 years old, and I'm living on Baldwin and Beverly. And at the other end of the street is Morriso. He's living by McCall and Baldwin. So I passed his house every day when I was going to school. And I saw him. I remember seeing him when I was a kid. The long black curly hair that he had and the really fancy shirts. Anyways, I saw this, my father was reading an article. I was looking at the pictures and I said, wow, it's amazing. And he asked what this was all about. And he said, it's about this artist here and he's one of us. And it was Norval Morriso. A whole paper spread with all his work in it. And I guess he had a really big show in Toronto and it was in the paper. And I was inspired. And what I was told, I don't remember this, but my mother told me about this. She said, why? She said, you went back to school and you went to town. And she said, when you were doing all your drawing, you have black lines around everything. And you were doing this for weeks until the teacher called me and she said, what's wrong with Philip? Is he mad at me? Because all my work was in black line after that, because I was inspired by the way Morriso is doing these amazing drawings of these animals and these people. And it struck me. And then it disappeared for a long time until I got older and I realized that, okay, this guy inspired me somewhere way back then. And so all my work now, all my outdoor work, all my murals across the city are all the woodland style paintings. And I realized just from my understanding about what that really means and that this is a cultural phenomenon that Morriso had started, and what he was doing was talking about our creation story, the beginning. And what he was doing was delivering our narratives about the history of our people and its cosmology. And there was no, parameters that kept them down. He would just tell everything the way it is. And of course, he has his quirks and things as a human being. But the important thing was that he was able to tell our stories when nobody was sharing. We didn't know our stories. When he was telling these stories, he was actually filling in all these blank areas about who we really were as Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Odawa, Chippewa, Mississauga. We're all related. He was telling our stories in these paintings, and that was really important because our cosmology was in there. And so the sense of spiritualism was a part of these stories, and we didn't know that. So my inspiration for myself as a young artist came from a simple spread of his work in a Sunday paper from my father was reading. And I had no idea that I reacted to this work. And so it was great that my mother told me the story. And the other good thing too is that I started thinking about a lot of the work that I did as a child, and that, I was winning all these awards in all the schools that I was at because they would enter my work into the local kind of history or art contests of the schools, the TDSB, and they were winning prizes. I wish I had some of these awards to see what they, or even remember some of the works, but I was winning them all the time. And so I think that's something that kept me going as an Indigenous person, as a displaced person, because I was in an environment where Indigenous people weren't welcome. I wasn't welcomed in the schools by my peers or a lot of the teachers. I dealt with a lot of racism. And so that artwork kind of always kept me just in the loop a bit. You know, I always had this ability to impress my classmates and my teachers enough that, okay, he's not such a bad guy, we'll let him in.
Thank goodness for art.
Yes.
Susan, what inspires you?
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, Philip, because my mom's maiden name is Morso. And so people are always like, are you related to Norvell? I'm like, distantly, but not. That's the automatic question. Are you related to Norvell? No. Because everyone back home knows I'm from the Morso family. So yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. But in terms of what inspires me, well, I mean, there's too many to mention, but you know, I think any Indigenous artist or scholar who's really you know, doing what Philip said, which is to believe in ourselves and believe in our own knowledge and validate our own knowledge without permission from anyone else, because for too long our knowledge has been invalidated and relegated to a realm of like we said, of myth or legend, as opposed to ecological knowledge, or you know, and that's due to disciplines like anthropology and archaeology and history and things like that. So anybody who's sort of taking that knowledge and going forward with it and believing in ourselves and believing in our ways and really bringing Indigenous power to the forefront, like, and the power being not a kind of power of conquest or domination, but a power that is a spiritually based power. That to me is inspiring. So many artists and poets and scholars, Indigenous people working in those fields are an inspiration to me. And then always my homelands. You know, although I live in Toronto and I have for over 10 years, I'm very connected to my home. I go home probably once a month, and I don't know if anyone's been to Treaty 3, but like our sunsets are elite. Like a beautiful place. It's a place that is mostly water. Like it's more water than land, especially where my dad's from, which is like the woods. And the beauty of it is undeniable. Like you feel the power of creation there. So that always, and all of the non-human beings that we are in relation to is Treaty 3 Anishinaabe. So the sturgeon, you know, the bear, the moose, like all of these beings whose land it is as well are an inspiration to me. And then always my grandparents, because I wouldn't be here if they had not
Persevered.
persevered, worked hard, passed on knowledge to us, you know, raised us up as Anishinaabe people, Ojibwe people. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm coming there. That sounds great.
Oh, it's beautiful. I'll show you a picture. Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah, I spent many summers in like the woods.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't been there yet, so I'm gonna have to go and check it out.
It's gorgeous.
Susan and I first met, full disclosure, in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
But very close to Winnipeg is Lake the Woods. Spent a lot of time. It is beautiful, and part of me is
Where is
there
it
as well.
exactly? Where is it exactly?
It's like sort of,
Manitoula? You're on Manitoula?
it's west of there. So if you know where Thunder Bay is,
Yeah.
I'm from like 4 hours west of Thunder Bay.
Wow. So
Yeah.
I was up in a place called Lac LaCroix.
Oh, I know Lac LaCroix. I have
I taught up
relatives.
there for a
Yeah.
couple of summers. The students, I would go up there during that kind of like May, June time of year, and I go up and teach them how to carve soapstone. We did some clan poles. We had these big cedar poles that we carved up, but was a great place that was. And those guys were very interesting people.
Yes.
And I heard so many interesting stories, and especially about the Sasquatch up there.
Yep.
Because they have all these. Because I got stuck when the power was out in high school, and they said, "Do you want to come and work with the little kids today? Maybe do some drawing." I said, "Sure, I'll come and do." So I went and did a drawing class with the little kids, and they said, "Draw something interesting for me, you guys." And so I went around the room after saying that, and I started seeing all these pictures with this hairy figure in the picture. It was the Sasquatch. all the kids had these stories about the Sasquatch, and it was important to them to talk about the Sasquatch. And so one night when I was there, a Sasquatch came through the village, and they said, "You know how you can tell the Sasquatch is coming?" And I said, "No." He said, "All the dogs will start barking like crazy, and then when the Sasquatch gets right into the village, they shut up. And you know, it's right there when it's quiet.
Yeah.
When the dogs stop barking, they see it's right in there." So I just listened to all the stories that the kids shared. I said, "Wow, I got to come back up here and just, document all this stuff, document all the stories, and just put a book together talking about this." Because, there's a lot of mythology around these creatures. But one of the stories is about these creatures are part of something. They're not like primitive creatures. These are like super beings that are here, and we're lucky to see them.
Yeah.
And I've heard more and more stories about these creatures. But that was close to Lake of the Woods.
Yeah, no, my namesake comes from Lake of the Woods. So he gave me my name. His name was Ron Gijik. He's since passed on, but he's from Lake of the Woods. So of course, because he gave me my name, I'm related to him. Yeah, and my mom actually worked there last summer in Lake of the Woods.
Right.
I mean, in Lac La Croix.
Yeah, and they're famous for the ponies.
Yeah, and they brought the ponies back actually.
Because it was their ponies that were part of the original ponies that the Spanish brought to North America. They traced the genealogy of these ponies all the way back to those ships that Spain sent over.
Okay.
And, they brought the horses and pigs. That's what they were famous for. What was the famous guy's name? It's like a name of a car now. What's the name of one of those old cars?
No idea.
Something DeSoto? DeSoto.
Okay.
There was a car called DeSoto, and he was one of those Spanish conquistadors who, pillaged and went across North America. And my grandfather up at Rooster Point, he said that there was 3 of them were buried up there because they came into their territory and they were acting like they were going to run everything, and they killed them. And they buried them right there, and they said, we have their helmets to prove that this is who they were. They have those kind of weird silver helmets that they were wearing, and because they had all this armor on too. I don't know how they managed to travel across North America with all that heavy weight.
Yeah.
I think those people were very tough people back then. Like even those settlers were very tough because they weren't very tall. I think the men were 5 feet tall. And so the native people were 6 feet tall. So all the native people look like giants to these guys, but there's a lot of mythology about how all the people were back then, and that's one of them.
Any questions from the group here? I feel like we could keep talking all day, but it's been just such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you Myseum Intersections again, and come out and see the work, and come out and see the explore the sites as well.
Isn't it amazing how fast this went by?
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody.
Hey, Rich.